setting out the main findings and implications from the research from my colleagues at the Centre for Cities who've been leading this project. That's Anthony Breach, who's a senior analyst, and Guilherme Rodrigues, who's a researcher. After we've heard from Anthony and Guilherme, we're going to hear from our three panelists. Our first panelist is Bridget Rosewell. Bridget is a commissioner at the National Infrastructure Commission and, amongst many other things, former chief economist at the Greater London Authority. Our second panelist is Simon Warburton. Simon is Transport Strategy Director at Transport for Greater Manchester. And our third panelist is Alex Williams, who's the Director of City Planning at Transport for London. So we're going to hear from Anthony and Guilherme first, and then we'll go to our panel. So, Anthony, over to you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. We'll just load up the presentation now. Can everyone see that? Okay, great. My name's Anthony. I'm a senior analyst here at Centre for Cities.
My name is Guilherme. I'm a researcher in the centre.
We're going to talk you through our most recent data tool that we've just published on comparing public transport outcomes and the built environment of UK cities with their European peers. So my colleague Guilherme is going to lead you through first. Get to the next slide. Great.
So quick sum up, as Andrew said, in last November, we published a report comparing the public transport accessibility in the UK largest cities with their Western European peers. And our analysis focused on what we call the supply, the amount of stations, both bus stations, tram and metro, but also the demand, how many residents live nearby those stations. And combining these two factors, we analyze the accessibility of British cities compared with the Western European ones. And today we released 10 case studies comparing individually with another Western European cities, which help visualize the problems and the issues and the challenges in British cities with European ones. So you can see here that we picked one example and we try to be as diverse as possible in terms of geographical ones. So Leeds compares with Marseille, French city, Liverpool with Turin, an Italian one. Then you can see Bilbao against Sheffield. And we compare cities with similar sizes in most of the cases, with the exception of Birmingham and Manchester, while Munich and Hamburg are slightly smaller, but you'll see in the tool the reason why we picked slightly smaller cities. So on average, 70% of people of the cities that we analyze in Western Europe can reach their city center in 30 minutes, which is roughly the average commuting time in those countries and also in the UK. While these 10, the largest cities of the UK that we selected, it's only 40%. So there's a huge gap. Even London, that we know that has a very good and comprehensive public transport system, it underperforms its only peer in Western world, Paris, the only two mega cities. And if you look at the chart, you can see that Paris and London, their accessibility score seems to be low, but that's not exactly a problem. It is a result of their success. So mega cities, they are so economically successful that people are willing to commute longer distances to benefit from higher wages and earnings that their labor market offers. But if you see that London performs slightly below Paris, but the remaining cities, the gap compared with their comparison threshold, it's much larger. If we zoom in at the cities individually, you can see that with the exception of Glasgow on the right side of the chart, our cities chronically underperform their Western European peers. But there's some degree of difference there. So a place like Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield, their accessibility is very low. It's below 40%, while their Western European peers, they hover around between 50 and 80%. While the smaller cities within our analysis, Liverpool, Nottingham, Bristol, they do underperform their peers, but the difference is not that stark. And one of the interesting points we found is that when you look at the accessibility scores and the difference to the European average, to the purple lines, it's hard to say which cities have, for example, a light rail system and the ones that don't. Leeds, that we know that doesn't have a metro or tram system, performs in a similar fashion to Sheffield, which has Supertram. Manchester has Metrolink, and it underperforms to a larger extent than a city like Bristol, for example. So this suggests that it's not only about the public transport infrastructure and the reach of this infrastructure. So in the next slide, instead of looking at the share of people that can reach the city center in the 30 minutes belt, we look how large is that 30 minutes public transport system belt. And here, instead of observing a chronic underperformance of British cities, we see a very mixed bag. So Birmingham, Glasgow, and Newcastle, they perform in line or above their peers in Western Europe, while we see an underperformance of cities like Leeds, Sheffield, and Manchester. But we clearly see a mismatch. So most cities, with the exception of Glasgow, they underperform in accessibility. But when we look at the amount of track stations that they have in 30 minutes belt, not all of them underperform. And the reason of that, it's demand. So how many people are living around those stations? If you see here, we aggregate the cities. In European cities, you can see the larger they get, the more residents they have per square kilometer density in their 30 minutes public transport belt. However, we don't observe that relationship in UK cities. So a brief example, Paris is denser in their city center in residential terms than Lyon. Lyon is denser than Marseille. Marseille is denser than Nice or Toulouse. However, we don't observe the same relationship in UK cities when you exclude London. So Birmingham is not denser than Liverpool, and Manchester is not significantly denser than Bristol. And this gives the conclusion that if we want to improve public transport accessibility, some places really need improvements in their infrastructure, but infrastructure alone cannot solve the problem. And we'll show one of the case studies that we have on our website, Marseille and Leeds. And then after the meeting, you can see the other 9 comparisons.
So let's take a concrete example by comparing Leeds versus Marseille using the new case studies and data tool that we produced. So it's well known that Leeds is the largest city in Europe without a metro system. And we can see this, how this impacts accessibility within Leeds versus Marseille. So while Leeds and Marseille are both cities that have a similar sized population, both around 800,000, 900,000 people, the share of the population in Leeds and Marseille that can reach the city centre in 30 minutes or less by public transport is very different. So roughly about 38–40% of people in Leeds can reach the city centre in 30 minutes or less by public transport. Whereas in Marseille, we're talking about 87%, 90% of the population can do the same thing on their public transport networks. So even though they're the same size, there's a big difference in the reach of the public transport network, the public transport network's accessibility, and accordingly, the size of the labour market within the city centre. So if we then use the new tool to actually look at Leeds and then compare it to Marseille, we can see some pretty big differences immediately. So although the scales here are slightly different, you know, if you take a look at the 2 mile bar and the 5 mile bar on the bottom, you can see that the scales are different, and that you know, the area covered by Leeds there is smaller. We can see that the physical footprint of Leeds' public transport network that reaches out 30 minutes from the city centre is smaller than Marseille's. So that lack of infrastructure in Leeds is causing the public transport accessibility of Leeds to decline. But the other big difference, when you look at the individual population squares that we've taken from Eurostat and mapped them onto that 30-minute footprint of the public transport network, is that Leeds's population density is much lower than Marseille's. And that's not just a kind of a small pocket in the city centre or kind of outlying suburbs. We see this kind of consistent trend across the city in that both the city centre and the urban core, and also the outer suburbs as well, are all much less dense than those in Marseille. And you know, that's kind of taken quite a high level view, but the tool also includes images from Google Street View, and these differences are quite clear just to see with your eyeballs. So on the left here, we've got an image of a neighbourhood within 20 minutes distance of the city centre by public transport, in Leeds, and then an equivalent location within 20 minutes of the city centre of Marseille by public transport. And we can see this pattern where the British cities tend to have this low-rise urban form, dominated by terraced housing, dominated by semi-detached housing, whereas in Marseille and other European cities, we see much more of this kind of mid-rise housing between 4 to kind of 6, 7, 8 stories, predominating across the urban form, and particularly with areas where we have really good public transport links and networks. And the net effect of this is to reduce the public transport accessibility of Leeds' city centre, because it forces people to live far away from public transport infrastructure and public transport stations, and instead compels them to live in similar kind of low-rise and mid kind of terrace and semi-detached housing without access to public transport, and relying instead on their car to access urban mobility. So we can see that the urban form of the city is actually imposing a very strong effect in terms of the demand for public transport, as well as also being a supply problem for public transport in Leeds' case. Again, if we add up all the numbers to look at the share of the population that can reach the city centre in Leeds and Marseille, just changing the supply of public transport within Leeds wouldn't close the gap with Marseille. So we can see that if the footprint of Leeds' public transport infrastructure expanded to cover the same area as Marseille, we only see an increase of 23% in the share of the population of Leeds that can reach the city centre by public transport within 30 minutes. A remaining 26% of the gap between Leeds and Marseille would remain unclosed, even if Leeds had just as good a metro system as Marseille does. And the only way that in which that 26% population gap can be made up is with changes to the built environment, is allowing people to live closer to public transport stations, and thereby kind of changing the demand for public transport and making it more publicly accessible. So there needs to be further densification of Leeds, especially around train stations and any future tram stations that are built, especially considering as well that the ONS is expecting Leeds' population to continue to grow, that we're going to continue to see urbanization, especially in our big cities outside of London. And currently our housing and our transport policy frameworks are not delivering the types of housing required to sustain this. So what does this mean in policy terms? Like, what should national government and local government do in order to address this challenge? Well, we're arguing that public transport investments and funding should not just be seen as kind of purely supply-side interventions on the public transport side. They also need to include a demand element, in that they should be linked to changes to the built environment and to densification in areas covered by not just new public transport infrastructure, but also existing public transport infrastructure should see urban areas around them densified and with a shift from a low-rise urban form to a mid-rise urban form. So local government currently finds it quite challenging to do so under conventional planning processes due to the existing kind of case-by-case planning process. But we argue that local development orders are a tool that local authorities currently have that can make the process more rules-based and speed up densification around stations. We also think that councils should be releasing areas of the greenbelt around train stations in which is currently no development or no built environment in areas well served by public transport infrastructure. But also that new investments in public transport by central government should be conditional on using LDOs and on using some of these tools to change the built environment around cities. We also think that national government should press ahead with planning reform, especially moving in the direction of improving certainty, introducing a more rules-based decision-making process, changes to urban land use. And that should, we're supportive of the current measures that are being rolled out by the government, but whether that will be renewal areas or smaller changes to the levelling up white paper, let's wait and see for those plans to come out. But also more broadly, if we move away from the current planning process in which local plans and local transport plans are completely separate documents that don't really talk to each other, if we move towards a more rules-based planning system, we could better integrate transport planning and also land use planning, so we can better monitor and provide both increased supply of public transport, but also demand for public transport as well. So That's, I'm trying to stop this. There we go. Great. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed to Anthony and Guillermo for a whiz through of the research. You can see the report and all the case studies on our website, and you can go through them at your leisure. But let's get some reflections on the report, but also more broadly some of the issues now that are being raised in the report and the case studies from our panelists. So, Bridget, over to you first. Give us a view from the National Infrastructure Commission and all the work that you've been doing in this area.
I would really welcome both this piece of work and the very commonsensical conclusions and policy recommendations that have been reached. I just hope that common sense can prevail, because I'm not sure it always does in policy circles, but we might come back to that proposition. It's very interesting actually to reflect that, first of all, doing the case for Crossrail, which is now scarily 20 years ago, it was very much trying to relate the need for the transport to the need, in that case, for densification around jobs. This is more thinking about, and we didn't really think about the residential side of it, I have to admit. We just kind of assumed, I think, that the people were going to be there. This is now taking it into that next step, which is, well, how does the transport and the density relate to one another? And what does that mean for the use of a system? A public transport system really works best when you're moving large or large-ish numbers of people. That's why it works best in London. And therefore that relationship is absolutely clear, but we've never pulled it together between the residential stuff and the public transport stuff. And that is clearly a huge gap. I think my caveat would be that we might need to reflect on is the historic form of low-rise, low-density terraced housing is not only incredibly widespread, but also popular. And experiments with high-rise in the immediate post-war period were terrible failures, apart from in some very limited places, and created a backlash against many of those buildings, which were badly built. They were too tall, weren't mid-rise, they were tall, all of that. I'm sure I don't have to rehearse that. So public acceptability for densification, residential densification, I think is something that local authorities and we who's to kind of try and help and advise are definitely going to have to be thinking about. We have an urban transport theme in the next NIA, and looking forward to you guys contributing to that theme. So all of this is incredibly welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. We'll come back to you, get your thought. We much discussed this in the office a lot, so I'm interested in your thoughts around what is it peculiar to the UK that they don't like density and sort of mid-rise. You see much more of that on the continent. Why is that? Maybe get some thoughts from you on that. But before we get into those kind of conversations, Simon, good to see you. I know you're having some problems getting on. Good to see you. Your reflections on the report, and then just a little bit about how TFGM and Greater Manchester is trying to bring some of these issues together in the way that you plot out the next phase of city development.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, and apologies for joining a little bit late. So I suppose some of the headline findings of the report are very familiar, aren't they? So what do we know? We know that we suffer from a legacy of underinvestment in our public transport systems in our cities, and I think we have welcomed at least the government's intent around seeing the levelling up of a public transport offer in Greater Manchester and other cities outside of London to that offer in London as being incredibly important. I mean, the report picks out that we've invested in Metrolink, and yet it still lags a long way behind, and it does. We've got the 7 lines that we have operating for Metrolink now. It still only has about 4% of the carrying capacity of the London Underground, so we've got some way to go in that regard, and densities of bus networks are equally something that concern us. If we compare the sort of density per capita of buses between London and Greater Manchester. There are twice as many buses per London resident as there are Greater Manchester residents. So density is also a fundamental issue in terms of the public transport offer. I think Bridget's right in terms of the challenge that we face within the UK around securing new models of densification. I mean, we've seen some pretty startling densification taking place here in Manchester city centre. When I first started working for Manchester City Council back in 1999, we reckoned we had about 2,000 residents in an area that you might have defined as the city centre. 2022, we've got about 40,000 residents. So we've seen an enormous leap forward, but it's a particular model of living that has driven. It's a relatively young model of living. It is certainly a relatively family-free model of living that we've seen so far. But it is achievable because we've seen it in London in a way that we haven't necessarily seen it elsewhere in the country. But to do that, you actually end up making, in part, a transport case for investment in the right social fabric in and around our inner suburbs. So high quality schooling is absolutely crucial if we want to attract families to develop new models of living in and around our better connected places, as our public spaces and so forth. In fact, if you go back to the work of the Rogers Commission and the urban what was it called now? The Urban Renaissance towards
Urban Renaissance. Urban Task Force, 1999. Showing your age, Simon. You're showing your age.
I think it might have been the first. I think it might have been the first thing I wrote a public report on, and it was absolutely spot on. Yet here we are, 23 years later, still grappling with the same issue. So we can probably learn from what came before, and really that's sort of where we've been trying to go in Greater Manchester. So we have planned public transport at a city region level for 25, 30 years now through the local transport plan model, championing that along the way. And we do now have 9 of our 10 authorities collaborating on one spatial plan for Greater Manchester, which allows us to then have a far better conversation across the city region around the role of density and the role of connectivity. But those 9 authorities are still having to make voluntary trade-offs between each other at the moment. Clearly, if we want to take that onto the next scale, then we need to think about how, as city regions, we can formally and collectively invest in the sort of social infrastructure that I was talking about before. And that's the sort of direction that I know that the Mayor here would like to see the devolution agenda move forward in the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Definitely come back to you touching on the attitudes to density and in some respects, the lack of models other than one, it seems. But we'll come back and get your thoughts on that as well. We'll pick up with Bridget. But Alex, just give us the view from London, and particularly again how the sort of transport aspect and the city development aspect work together, and in what ways.
Yeah, thanks. And a really interesting report. And I think we're all in danger of violently agreeing, aren't we? So, from our perspective, we are very big supporters of higher density. It's a more efficient city layout. It's a less car-dependent layout. And we recognise that delivering the policies in the London plan about greater densities, particularly around public transport infrastructure, is fundamental to shifting people away from their car and getting more people on sustainable modes, public transport, cycling, walking. It's just worth reflecting as well, because one of the things we haven't mentioned is the pandemic. And what we've seen with the pandemic is London, UK cities and European cities have seen a big reduction in public transport usage. 20 to 30% of their customers have gone. And what's quite interesting is that some of the denser cities in Europe have recovered quicker than UK cities. So I think it's worth looking at it through the kind of lens of COVID recovery as well, really. But if we go to why we aren't dense like our European neighbours, I think Bridget referred to it really about a lot of people like living in low density locations. And it's quite interesting if you've ever been to a planning committee where they're trying to get through a large development. Boy, is that tough. It's a tough place to be. I've been there many a time myself, and it's difficult for councillors because of the really strongly and vehemently held views from those of people who oppose density. But it makes it really tough for councillors to push through those decisions, tough for officers and also for developers as well, really. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's a reason why we haven't done it, because it's tough to do, really. And in terms of how we address some of those challenges going forward, I would say there are 4 areas to look at. One is learning the lessons from the developers who do it well. And there are a lot that have developed high density, really great places like Argent and King's Cross, or British Land will do the same in Canada Water. And they invested a huge amount of time, but well before they put in a planning application, to kind of bring the community with them and build that trust before they came to come in with a formal application. Took a lot of political leadership to get it through in both cases, but they've done a great job and they'll deliver great places that are high density. I think that planning reform has a role, and I particularly like the local development orders. I think that might help. But part of my problem is I've been in this game a long time, and I've heard many planning reforms that will be the panacea to all of our problems, and it doesn't quite work, really. And I do think the government needs to provide a clearer message in this space. I'll give you an example. We have 2 development sites, I think about 300 homes on each location, where it's gone through all of the planning process for developments on a station car park, ticks all the right buttons, and it's been, both sites have been called in by the government because of, frankly, NIMBY reasons about why they don't want to proceed with it, really. So a bit of spin that they want to support development, but in reality, they can't help stopping us doing it when they want to. So I think that there needs to be a consistent and clear message from government that they support this growth, rather than cherry picking ones that they don't want to do when they don't particularly like it. In terms of transport investment, I think your report highlights the importance of the bus, and Mayor is getting control of it, as we've done in London. I completely understand where the Mayor of Manchester is pushing for that. That will deliver a big return. I do also think from transport investment, we need to think about where we focus our effort. Crossrail will arrive very soon. It will be fantastic, absolutely stunning. But the reality is, I think that the next round of mega projects will take a long time to deliver, really. And I do think we need to pitch for more achievable, smaller interventions, like extensions to Dublin Light Railway or tram systems outside of London and Leeds and tram extension. It just feels to me that HS2 is the next mega project, but I'm not sure that the other one's going to come along that quickly, really. And in that space, look at some of your more achievable, smaller schemes that could deliver what we need to see in places like Leeds and other cities that help deliver a lot of housing growth, but aren't mega expensive, really. So I think it's a really welcome report. I just think there's a few times to reflect on why density hasn't happened and how we can help move that forward. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. So you finish there. So let's start there. Bridget, come back to you, because you mentioned, well, it's firstly, very common sense kind of approach, but you worry about common sense. But beyond that, you talked about density, and people don't particularly like density in the UK. It seems also that our model of density, which seems to be only one, which is relatively high rise, mainly focused on younger childless people or households with not much else going on. Is that part of the problem? I mean, Alex said, there are good developers that are doing kind of reasonable density. Maybe we need to expand that. But what's your thought on why we dislike density so much, Bridget?
So I think that the experience of not low density was painful, because it wasn't mid-rise, it was high-rise, and many of those buildings have had to come down. They were unpopular, badly built, blah, 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 blah. So we've not developed a visible, successful mid-rise offer, if you like, that people can see and think, oh, that's good. Although the highest density borough, certainly in London, I think nationally, is actually South Kensington and Kensington generally, with fantastically desirable mansion flats, high quality garden squares. You know, you've got, so the other part of this is the public and the semi-public realm. So what is the associated public investment or public space investment that goes alongside the development, which is one of the things that Argent, after all, did so well in King's Cross, the public space. But I think also, particularly for families, you want the semi-public space. You want the places where the kids can play and so on and so forth. And that's what we've not got a template for, that people can see and people can think about, and that looks great. And the other part of that is, for example, there was a proposal in the planning white paper, and I was involved in some of the workshops on all of that, to allow people to put an extra story on their houses. That's an immediate piece of densification, which goes back to the 18th century, actually. You can go, and 17th century, you can go around and see where people added on a bit of space. And yet the struggle to make, you know, and the building regs people, and the way everybody gets in the way of something which could be otherwise case by case, simple by simple, people just wanting to put dormers in, all of those small changes which increase density without big planning applications, without needing 300 more houses, and which then use the existing transport system to its best effect. Because the other thing that I think is really important is that it's not good enough. Sorry, Simon, it's not good enough to say it's not fair that we don't get the money that they get in London. We need to show why that money is well spent, not just because that's good, it's better, but because there's actually a payback, because it makes the place more effective. So you need to show the financial case for these things as well.
Yeah, no, very good. Simon, I mean, just pick up on that point, because I think that's, you know, where Greater Manchester is now, around thinking about how the different components come together. I mean, you touched on it a little bit, in the sense that, you know, the city centre of Manchester looks like it does, and quite dramatically different from 10 or even, you know, certainly 20 years ago. In some respects, the criticism is it's of a certain type, which was kind of tallish towers, but there's not much of that in between, that mid-rise 4 to 5 story, which we see in many European places. I mean, just your thoughts on where that is, and how we might get towards some of that in somewhere like Greater Manchester. Is that parcel of your thinking?
Yeah, it is, and I think we're starting to see a level of interest in the market that takes us in that direction. So if you take the work that's underway at the moment in and around Stockport Town Centre, so Stockport Town Centre, for those who don't know, Greater Manchester is about 5 miles to the south of the city centre, incredibly well served into the city centre by the rail system, depending on the time of day, 6 to 8 trains an hour into the city centre. So if you like, for those people who know London, it's a sort of Clapham Junction, if you like, and therefore there's enormous potential to develop exactly that sort of mid-rise model there. Now, even 10 years ago, that is a concept that would have been largely poo-pooed by the market. You know, there's some pretty big transport infrastructure that makes its way through the town. It's a town centre that's faced all of the usual challenges. Actually, the council with developers now has really got their head around that. It is exactly that sort of more dense mid-rise model that they're promoting. They're promoting it because of the presence of the rail station, and there's some real potential to move forward in that regard. One area that's now needed as we transform our model of the railway, hopefully for the better, is actually for the railway in turn then to be able to respond. So some fascinating debates that are taking place at the moment over the extent to which the railway is desperate to jealously guard land that it may need for some operational purpose in 25 years' time, or otherwise you could actually develop into immediately adjacent dense residential. And I think that's something where we need our transport operators generally to see that the real value in proximity and density. So it is undoubtedly starting to happen, but in many of the boroughs that we have still, the market's natural response to housing need is to find the farthest flung corner and work out how many 5-bedroom homes they can build on it. So we're still at the early stage, and we're still at the early stage in part, I think, because an awful lot of the transport system is a Victorian legacy. We didn't necessarily always build out through our northern towns with a view to clustering around those stations in the way that is the modern model. So the level of organisation and the level of assembly and the role of local authorities in bringing that about is not insubstantial. Just to come, which sort of links really to Bridget's point, because she's right, and we've always looked to try to make the argument in Greater Manchester around payback, and actually wherever possible we've looked to invest our own money into the transport system, and then actually have a debate with Treasury around the extent to which we could earn back against some of the investment that we've made, recognising that most of the returns for transport investment from a public perspective still find their way back into the central exchequer. I think that's absolutely right. I think the question is how we make a case if we want to go about securing economic transformation. So if levelling up is about bucking the trend, and that trend is very profound in the UK, and you can't help but feel that there is something in making comparisons between some of our cities in the UK and their European comparisons that reflects the fact that they don't necessarily face quite the same economic dichotomy between the capital and the other cities. Then we need to be able to bring in longer term considerations around payback, and we need to be able to bring in longer term considerations around how we actually go about recording and responding to economic transformation. We noted, for example, when government did publish all of the documentation around the integrated rail plan, that within there's a reference to the importance of being able to represent levelling up in transport appraisal, and then you actually get into the appendix to the IRP and you find that there's a little footnote that says, I'm ever so sorry, but we didn't quite have time to get to that before we needed to publish the integrated rail plan. Yeah. So we're still in the foothills, I think, in terms of finding a way of being able to properly represent long-term transformation, and that would help us enormously in terms of being able to make more of sorts of integrated place-based cases that we're currently trying to make for Stockport.
Okay, very good.
We have to get away from the idea that the past is the guide to the future.
Yeah.
Because the whole point is that you want to make investments where the future will be different.
Will be different.
So while you're stuck with all these models and getting people off that, and I mean that footnote's really interesting because I think it almost comes out of the work we did for the what was it called, rail needs assessment. Well, I wanted us to do more on property values and all of those sorts of things, which would be part of creating that payback. But it's so out of the normal way of doing things that actually it takes more time, much more time to get all that thinking done. And that rail needs thing, we only had 6 months to put the whole thing together. So it was, you know, there was a whole load of chunks of stuff missing. But we think 20 years ago, all transport assessments were only done on the past.
Yeah.
That was all there was. That was all. It was all about time save, but putative theoretical time saving. So at least we have checked. We have moved. We have moved. Not as much as we should, but we have moved.
Right. Let me let's move on and get because there's quite a few questions in, and I'm trying to get through. So this was to you. Well, it's not specifically to you, but I'm going to ask you, Alex. So there's a question from Patrick Wilcox. He says, so do combined authorities need area-wide planning frameworks to link transport planning with land use planning? And I guess flip it round and say, that's what kind of London has, right? Kind of London plan plus, TfL doing its thing. What's the advantage that brings to thinking about these two things and bringing them together? And
I just think it's a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer that you have to integrate the two organisations and functions, and it's clearly evident that it has delivered great results within London. The Nick Rainsford wrote the GLA Act. It was a stroke of genius, that act, to integrate land use planning, transport planning, and also now environment as well. Those three being integrated together, particularly if you look at the challenge of climate change and poor air quality, it was absolute brilliance. And I just think that is the model for other cities to follow, to have that consolidation of powers, but also, most importantly, the financial autonomy to get stuff done. And I think that's one of the concerns I've got with the approach of the government through levelling up or other initiatives, is that there isn't a financial autonomy. That the mayor of Manchester or the mayor of London can write a bid to government. That's not financial autonomy. That's just a load of wasted effort writing a bid where they'll ask for more information when you've written the bid. And I just think that if you want to get stuff done and you want to deliver real growth, you need genuine financial autonomy, rather than just saying there's a pot of money to write a bid and we don't actually have the guidelines to write the bid at the moment. That's hopeless, completely hopeless. So integration, yes, but financial autonomy to get stuff done, rather than write out the Whitehall office where tuppence ain't nearly you won't get from them.
Okay, I'll come to you.
I was just going to say.
Go on, and you come in, and I'll get.
Alex is absolutely right on both points. I think what we shouldn't lose sight of, though, is that contemporary political debate is quite a challenge to that. So the more that we see communities representing their needs through new channels, the more there is a challenge to decisions being taken at a relatively macro scale and being challenged in terms of overriding local community considerations. We've seen it quite starkly recently in the debate around the Clean Air Plan, for example.
Yeah.
In Greater Manchester. So it's undoubtedly the case that we have to be able to take those decisions, or we have to be able to set the right planning frameworks at a substantial level. At the same time, we need to learn from some of the unpopularity that can bring, and have a level of sensitivity that means that localism can still play its role. Because I think the other critical element is that these regimes only work if they can stand the test of time, and that they don't suffer the next planning reform that comes along. So anticipating that will be the challenge, and developing something that has the right level of local sensitivity to it, I think is so important.
No, that is very important. I mean, Bridget,
the first step in all of this, though, has to be to simplify the number of funds that you have to apply to do anything at all, and bring all of that together. I mean, it's absolutely Alex's point. So if we just did that, I mean, so you're right. I mean, there's whole loads of political sensitivities. So let's focus on one deliverable thing, putting all these funds into one pot and allowing organisations to spend them, while at the same time sort of working towards the integration point, might be the practical. I mean, it's not, it doesn't solve all the problems, but at least it would be a practical next step.
Yeah, no, that is I think that is fair. I mean, just Bridget, your thought on, so we've had a couple of questions on on, the use of local development orders or urban development corporations as a way to kind of bring some of this stuff together, particularly around, say, existing or proposed transport nodes, where we've got kit there already, but we need to drive activity and increase activity around them. They're not widely used. LDOs are certainly not widely used. DCs are occasionally used. Just, is there something blocking other than politics, sort of authorities using them, or is it all politics?
I think it is largely the politics, and I was very much hoping that we would have seen 2 or even 3 development corporations along the line of the East-West rail route, to facilitate the development of urban villages or small towns or whatever around those transport nodes. And I think that was definitely politics, in that all of that stuff got pulled right up to Whitehall, and now they've realised that doesn't work either. So they pushed it back down again, and now nobody knows where to go. And what we've done is wasted years actually in engaging in this process. So I think, but to get the DCs, you do have to actually say, this is what we're going to do, and have some coherent push to actually deliver it. I think on the bigger scale, obviously you use a DC rather than necessarily an LDO. So you say they're not widely used, and I think they're not widely understood, and that's probably because everybody who might understand them is too busy filling in forms, asking for small grants from small bloody funds to do this, that, or the next thing, and they just run out of oomph and effort.
Yeah, finite resource, badly allocated.
Planning in local authorities, an enormously constrained resource.
Yeah. Simon, is it the politics of the LDO? I know Stockport's got a DC to do some things, if I'm right. But that's a slightly different sort of element to actually, if we're going to marshal the land, if we're going to marshal the resources to do the things, why aren't we seeing more of these sort of instruments being used? Because you hear this from government a little bit, right? I mean, rightly or wrongly, they say, these powers are available or instruments are available, they're not being used, and we get frustrated about that. And I'm not justifying their point. I'm just just repeating their point. But just your sense on that.
Yeah, I mean, Bridget's point around so many entities living hand to mouth is undoubtedly one of the elements within that. I think there are still models of organisation that mean that we behave naturally in institutional silos around each other. HS2 is a great example. So HS2 is the single biggest moment of connectivity transformation that's going to take place in the north of England for as long as we can project ahead. I could go on and make a series of political comments about that's because Northern Powerhouse Rail is clearly not going to come about through the IRP. You know where I'm going. Yeah. HS2 certainly is. And therefore, we need to be able to combine the forces of local agencies and national agencies, particularly in the form of HS2, to best bring about the opportunity that HS2 presents. That's why over a decade ago, we were making the case when HS2 was first being brought forward for HS2 to think of itself as a transport and development company from the outset. And what it's done in the decade in between is to plan a railway in splendid isolation of anything else. And what's happened in between is that the private sector has capitalised enormously on the future connectivity benefits in terms of market values that will accrue to the land alongside the stations, and a whole economic geography has changed around the stations, and the only thing that has remained absolutely constant is the shape and form of the plan of HS2 that sits right through the middle of it all. So we don't have a plan that has evolved to fit with an economic picture, nor do we have an entity which is encouraged to think in terms of the economic values that will accrue from its investment. And as a result, there is so much future value that could have been captured and returned into the scheme or returned into beneficial investments around the scheme that will be missed, and we cannot continue to behave that way. You know, look at the development of something like a tram line in Copenhagen. The Copenhagen tram developer from the outset sees themselves as a housing developer as well at the same time. So they are incentivized to plan a scheme that works well in terms of density of housing, all the way back to your report, and there is value from that development that is accrued directly back into the transport scheme. It's not difficult, this stuff really, but it does require institutional alignment from the outset to get it right.
Alex, your thoughts on that? It's not difficult, but we don't do very much of it. It seems to me to be the worst. Seems to me to be the worst kind of things, right? Where we recognise that it's not hard, and yet we still don't do it. I'd much rather somebody tell me this was all very, very, very complicated and very, very hard, and you're asking for, you know, a moon and a stick. But in some respects, we're not, and yet we don't. So, you know. Give me some
I think
hope,
we are
Alex. Give me some
risk
hope.
averse in this country on land assembly before major projects. You think about, with one of the lessons from Crossrail, is should you know, when the consent was drawn for the Act, that was very narrow about, you know, to deliver the transport product, and if it was a wider boundary to purchase the land for future development and to help pay for it, it probably would have saved the project a lot of money, or generated a lot of money, in the way that, you know, it's happened with the Olympics, isn't it? The Olympic Park Development Corporation, huge investment to create the games, but that is being paid back for by a huge amount of development that's happening. You know, it's happened over the last 10 years since the game, really. So that model has worked in the Olympic Games, of a development corporation, you know, with a target to deliver the housing and to refund some of the original projects. So it can work. Equally, there are other areas where we've developed huge numbers of housing and jobs, like Northern Line Extension. There was no development corporation there. There was no aligned route until quite a long way down the process, actually. But we delivered circa 20,000 homes in a space of about 10 years, really. And that was about very clear political leadership, but a clear political leadership at every tier of government: local government, regional government, and national government, all bought into this vision and went for it, at a real pace. So we had a line on a map in 2007, and it was opened in 2020 for a tube extension. That is unheard of. Yeah. But as I say, no development corporation, but clear political leadership, clear alignment that got it delivered, really. So I think there's often a lot of debate in planning circles about what is the right structure for this, and I think what works for whatever the local area is, actually. But I think the underpins it is clear political leadership bought into that vision. Yeah, that's about. And it touches on your points about. I'll come to you to say on the clear signals and clear signals over time that these are the types of investments or the types of partnerships that we're looking to strike, and that involves different tiers of government, not just from a funding point of view, but from a regulatory point of view and everything else. Well, and a planning authority view at the local level. Yes, that was fundamental. Exactly.
Yeah. But a lot depends on your objectives, doesn't it? It depends that you've set an objective which can ginger everybody up, and that people can see and all sign into. Northern Line Extension, I mean, there were some backtrackers, I suppose, at some points. I remember a massive argument about what it should be called at one point, and which names come. Anyway, but there's an objective. Here's a limited space. What are we going to do with it? The tunnel is underground, doesn't affect anybody. HS2, on the other hand, is right across the country. Very, very difficult to get an aligned set of objectives to do that. I wanted originally to say government just takes a decision about the main track, if you like, but then cities decide where you go into the city, where the station is going to be in the city, what's the development around it, da-di-da-di-da. But it became, as you said, I think, Simon, it became simply a transport project. How fast can we go? Yeah. Not about where you're going to stop. but just how fast you go through it, which is just bonkers. But unless you start off by saying, here's the set of objectives, this is what this thing is trying to do, and the objective it set out with is how fast can we go? That was its objective.
Yeah.
Instead of how does it help all the different cities that it's going to touch?
Yeah.
And it's taken us 10 years to get it back to that set of objectives.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a minute or two left, so I just
sorry,
wanted to get. No, it's fine. I just wanted to get your final thought, Simon. Maybe start with you, and then come to you, Alex, and finish with you, Bridget. But the city region transport settlements, very easy to say. They are, my sense, a step in the right direction. There's a kind of 5-year funding window, in theory, at least. That is the way to go, right? I mean, we can do better and we can go further. Simon, just your final thought on that as a vehicle for us to build on, at least.
So it's the right start point, isn't it? But it's got some way to go. So we've long pointed out that we've got a national highway system here. We've got a national rail system. They've worked on 5-year funding models that are driven from an organised needs assessment. When we've now got the basis of the potential of the future 5-year model, Good Start.
Yeah.
Not actually driven necessarily from a needs assessment yet. It's driven from centrally defined budgets against which we then need to cut our cloth. And for the avoidance of doubt, CRSTS takes us maybe 40% of the way that we would have really needed to have gone to maintain the right pace. However, they're only part of the picture because they're a capital settlement.
Yeah.
And a revenue funding model alongside capital funding is critical. While CRSTS has been a pretty successful debate between DfT and Treasury and a Good Start, BSIP seems to have fallen apart in a big way. And both were needed in order to start to get us into a relatively healthy position as city regions. So a good start, but a long way to go.
Okay, very good. Alex, 30 seconds from you on that kind of longer term. Obviously, TfL has been there, not currently. Obviously, it's a very short term, ongoing funding issues. But
we'd love a long term funding deal. Our funding runs out at the end of June. So we're a multi-billion pound business. And we have no certainty at all from the 1st of July onwards. So a long-term funding deal for us is 5 months. But we would love 5 years. We'd take 2, 3, anything longer than 5 months. So
okay,
we're up for that.
Very good. That's point taken. Bridget, final thought from you. Obviously, the commission was heavily involved in making those making the arguments for the 5-year settlements, right?
Well, it's you say 5 years is better than 5 months, that's for sure. But five-year settlements are fine, so long as there's going to be another 5-year settlement after it, so that you've still got the ability to create the 20-30-year vision that all cities need if they're going to make sense of their transport and their development needs.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Very good. We could definitely carry on, but it's just gone one, so we definitely need to finish. Big thanks to you three, my panelists, Bridget, Simon and Alex. Also thanks to my colleagues, Anthony and Guilherme, for their presentation on the findings. Thank you all for joining. Good questions. We've got through a few of them, but not all of them, so apologies for that. You can get the report and the case studies on our website, centreforcities.org, and recording of today's event if you want to go back and listen to it again.